The ballroom inside the Fairmont Copley Plaza glowed like liquid gold beneath towering chandeliers, every crystal reflecting across polished marble floors and champagne towers tall enough to impress old Boston money. Claire Whitmore stood near the center of the crowded fundraiser in a midnight blue gown that had taken her 3 weeks to choose, though Daniel barely glanced at it when she stepped out of the car earlier that evening. Around her, senators, investors, and charity board members drifted through the room with effortless confidence, their laughter soft and expensive beneath the slow violin orchestra playing near the grand staircase. Daniel adjusted the silver cufflinks at his wrist while scanning the crowd for donors. He did not look at Claire when he spoke. "You do not need to speak tonight. Just smile." His tone stayed calm, polished for public spaces, but the words settled against her ribs like cold metal. Claire held her expression perfectly still. Years ago, she might have tried to joke her way through the sting. Tonight, she simply nodded once and lifted her champagne glass without taking a sip. A photographer called Daniel's name near the ballroom entrance. Flashbulbs exploded across the gold-paneled walls while Daniel stepped forward immediately, straightening his posture with practiced political elegance. Claire followed half a step behind him, invisible in the exact way wealthy marriages sometimes made women invisible. Nearby guests greeted Daniel warmly, praising his latest development deal, and the Whitmore family expansion into Manhattan real estate. Claire listened quietly as though hearing a speech she had memorized long ago. Then an older donor turned toward her with a distracted smile. "Excuse me, miss, could you tell us where the restrooms are?" The question landed gently, almost harmlessly, which somehow made it worse. Claire opened her mouth slightly before Daniel answered first. "Down the east corridor," he said smoothly. He never corrected the man. The donor thanked him and walked away without another glance at her. Claire felt the silence afterward more than the humiliation itself. Daniel reached for another handshake while conversation flowed onward around them as if nothing had happened. Her fingers tightened carefully around the stem of her champagne flute. Not enough for anyone to notice. Across the ballroom, a woman in a white satin dress touched Daniel's arm while laughing at something he whispered. Claire recognized her instantly from campaign dinners and foundation luncheons. Vanessa Cole. Young, polished, politically useful. Daniel smiled at Vanessa with an ease Claire had not seen directed toward her in years. It was not flirtation that hurt. It was familiarity. The effortless warmth. The version of him she used to believe only existed in private. Music swelled softly through the ballroom while servers passed silver trays of lobster crostini beneath the chandelier glow. Claire suddenly felt overheated inside the crowded room despite the winter storm raging outside the hotel windows. She stepped away before anyone noticed. Her heels echoed quietly across the marble as she moved toward the balcony corridor overlooking downtown Boston. Rain streaked against the tall glass doors facing the city, blurring red taillights below into watercolor smears of crimson and gold. Claire rested one hand lightly against the cool railing and exhaled slowly for what felt like the first time all evening. Behind her, laughter continued inside the ballroom. Warm, wealthy, untouched. She stared out at the rain-covered streets below until movement inside the glass reflection caught her attention. Daniel stood near the center of the ballroom beside Vanessa again. This time he was laughing openly, head tilted back slightly, one hand resting at the small of Vanessa's back as photographers moved around them. Claire watched silently through the reflection instead of turning around directly. Somehow the distance created by the glass made the image sharper. More honest. The city lights shimmered across the rain between them while orchestra music drifted faintly through the doors. For a moment, Claire looked less like a wife standing outside a gala, and more like someone observing her own life from the wrong side of the window. Then Daniel glanced toward the balcony unexpectedly. Their eyes nearly met through the reflection before another guest stepped between them. Claire lowered her gaze first. Inside the ballroom, applause suddenly erupted near the stage, as Daniel's father began announcing the next round of political donors. Claire remained motionless beside the rain-streaked glass while her phone vibrated once inside her clutch. She pulled it out slowly. The screen displayed a calendar reminder she had forgotten to delete. Wedding anniversary. Tomorrow. The rain followed them home from the gala like a shadow stretching across Boston after midnight. Water streamed down the black windows of Daniel's town car, while the city lights blurred into gold and white streaks against the glass. Claire sat quietly beside him, her hands folded carefully in her lap, the reminder notification still glowing faintly on her dark phone screen before disappearing into silence. Wedding anniversary. Tomorrow. Daniel scrolled through emails without looking at her once during the entire drive back to Beacon Hill. The inside of the car smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne, familiar enough to feel suffocating. Outside, February rain hammered softly against the streets while pedestrians hurried beneath umbrellas along Commonwealth Avenue. Claire watched them instead. Strangers crossing intersections. Couples laughing beneath awnings. People whose evenings probably ended with warmth instead of silence. By the time they arrived home, the storm had deepened. Their brownstone stood glowing softly against the wet streetlights, elegant and cold at the same time. Inside, the housekeeper had already retired for the evening, leaving only dim hallway lamps illuminating the marble floors and framed campaign photographs lining the walls. Claire slipped off her heels near the staircase while Daniel loosened his tie and walked directly toward his office. No goodnight kiss. No acknowledgement of the date waiting after midnight. Just routine. The sound of ice dropping into a whiskey glass echoed faintly from behind the office doors. Claire stood alone in the entryway for several seconds before following slowly. Daniel remained near the fireplace with one hand in his pocket, city lights flickering through the tall windows behind him. He looked exhausted in the kind of way successful men often did. Not physically tired. Emotionally unavailable. Claire leaned lightly against the doorway. "Did you ever actually love me?" The question came out softer than she intended. Daniel paused while loosening his tie completely this time. His eyes stayed on the amber whiskey swirling inside the crystal glass. "You wanted too much from me." No anger. No cruelty. Somehow that made the words hurt more. Claire felt something inside her grow strangely still. Years earlier, she would have defended herself immediately. She would have apologized for asking difficult questions. Tonight she only nodded once, as though accepting information she had always known somewhere deep beneath denial. Daniel took a sip and moved toward his desk, already mentally leaving the conversation behind. Claire watched him quietly for another moment before turning away. Upstairs, the master bedroom remained untouched and perfectly arranged, like a luxury hotel suite waiting for guests instead of a marriage. Rain slid slowly down the windows overlooking the city while Claire removed her earrings at the vanity. Her reflection looked composed, elegant, almost detached. She opened the drawer searching for sleep medication and accidentally found an old leather appointment planner tucked beneath financial documents. Daniel rarely used paper schedules anymore. Curious, she flipped it open absent-mindedly. The pages stopped her instantly. Anniversary dinner reservations. Every year. A different restaurant each time. The Harbor Room. Mistral. Contessa. Reservations carefully booked months in advance. And beside every single one, written neatly in Daniel's assistant's handwriting, one word appeared in black ink. Cancelled. Claire stared down at the pages while thunder rolled softly outside. Some cancellations happened days before the date. Others only hours prior. One reservation from 3 years ago included a note attached beside it. Senator dinner conflict. Reschedule unnecessary. Claire closed the planner slowly, her fingertips trembling for the first time all evening. Downstairs, Daniel's office light still glowed beneath the doorway. Claire carried a stack of campaign folders toward him automatically, almost out of habit after years of quietly organizing the pieces of his life no one else noticed. As she approached the office hallway, unfamiliar voices stopped her before she reached the door. Daniel's father. One of their attorneys. Claire froze immediately in the shadows beside the staircase. "The timing matters," his father said calmly from inside the office. "The divorce announcement cannot interfere with the Manhattan expansion." Claire felt the folders press harder against her chest. Another voice answered quietly. "We should finalize asset protection before speaking with her directly." Then Daniel spoke. Low. Controlled. "I know." Silence swallowed the hallway around her. Rain continued tapping against the windows while somewhere upstairs the grandfather clock ticked softly through the darkness. Claire stood completely motionless beside the staircase, hidden from view while the conversation inside continued in fragments she could no longer fully hear through the rushing sound building inside her chest. Not because she was shocked the marriage was breaking. Deep down she had known for a long time. What shattered something quietly inside her was realizing they were planning the end of her life together before anyone had even planned the dignity of telling her. By morning, the rain over Boston had turned thinner, softer, like the city itself had grown tired of carrying the storm. Claire stood alone beside the kitchen windows watching gray light settle over Beacon Hill, while the espresso machine hummed quietly behind her. The house felt unusually still for a place once built around political dinners, staff schedules, and Daniel's endless calendar of meetings. Somewhere upstairs, closet doors opened and closed with mechanical precision, while Daniel prepared for another day, as though nothing inside their marriage had shifted overnight. Claire wrapped both hands around a porcelain coffee cup she no longer remembered making. She had not slept. Every sentence from the office hallway still lingered beneath her skin with unbearable clarity. Asset protection. Timing matters. Speak with her directly. She had spent years believing emotional distance was temporary. Stress. Pressure. Politics. Now she understood something colder. Daniel had simply adapted to living without considering her feelings at all. By late afternoon, they arrived separately at Whitmore Legal Group downtown for the first formal meeting with attorneys. The building overlooked Boston Harbor, all glass walls and polished steel designed to impress powerful people before negotiations even began. Claire wore a cream wool coat over a charcoal dress, elegant enough to appear composed, though her stomach tightened with every floor the elevator climbed. Daniel stood beside her in silence, scrolling through market updates on his phone, while rainwater streaked slowly across the mirrored elevator walls. The reflection beside Claire barely resembled the woman who once believed marriage guaranteed emotional safety. Her eyes looked calmer now. Not happier. Just quieter. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and leather portfolios. Attorneys spoke in measured voices about logistics, timelines, media discretion, and property evaluations while assistants moved carefully around trays of sparkling water and legal documents. No one mentioned love. No one mentioned grief. Claire answered questions politely when required, her voice soft but steady beneath the cold rhythm of professional negotiation. Daniel rarely looked directly at her during the meeting. He discussed assets the way executives discuss corporate restructuring. Efficient, controlled, emotionally detached. Then suddenly, without warning, the entire building went dark. The overhead lights snapped off. The conference room fell silent except for the distant hum of emergency generators failing somewhere below the harbor streets. One of the attorneys sighed under his breath while another muttered about the storm damaging nearby power lines. Emergency lighting flickered weakly along the hallway outside, casting long shadows through the glass walls. Phones lost signal almost immediately. Elevators stopped operating. "We may be stuck here a while," someone announced. The attorneys eventually relocated downstairs searching for updates, leaving Claire and Daniel temporarily alone inside the darkened office suite, while rain battered the windows overlooking the harbor. For the first time in years, there was nowhere for either of them to escape. Daniel loosened his tie slowly and stared out toward the water. Claire remained seated near the conference table, her fingers resting lightly against untouched legal papers glowing pale beneath emergency lights. Silence expanded between them. Heavy, intimate, unfamiliar. Finally Daniel turned toward her. His eyes paused on her hands first, slightly trembling against the polished table surface. "Claire!" Her breath caught almost invisibly. He had not spoken her name gently in so long that the sound itself felt dangerous. Daniel stepped closer, slower this time, as if realizing too late how far away she had become. "I did not." The hallway lights suddenly flickered back to life. Elevator systems restarted with a low mechanical hum throughout the building. Voices returned outside the conference room while attorneys reappeared carrying phones and folders. Whatever Daniel almost said disappeared unfinished between them. Claire stood immediately before he could continue. She smoothed one hand over her coat sleeve and stepped around him with perfect composure. But something inside her had shifted during those dark minutes together. Not reconciliation. Not hope. Clarity. That evening the rain finally stopped. Boston streets reflected silver beneath cold streetlights while Daniel returned home after midnight smelling faintly of whiskey and expensive cigar lounges. Claire remained awake downstairs in the dark kitchen, illuminated only by city light filtering through the windows. Daniel loosened his coat, exhausted and distracted, before pouring himself another drink without noticing the small velvet box resting beside his glass. Claire stood quietly near the marble counter watching him realize what it was. Her wedding ring lay inside under the soft kitchen light. Simple. Elegant. Final. Daniel stared down at it in silence before finally lifting his eyes toward her. Claire did not cry. She did not explain herself. She only stepped past him calmly and walked toward the staircase barefoot, disappearing into the quiet house without turning back while the untouched whiskey glass remained beside the ring between them like the last unfinished sentence of their marriage. Seattle smelled different from Boston in early October. The air carried rain and cedar instead of old stone and political ambition. 1 year after leaving Beacon Hill, Claire Whitmore no longer flinched every time her phone vibrated. The silence around her apartment no longer felt like abandonment either. It felt earned. Morning fog drifted slowly between glass towers downtown, while ferries moved across Elliott Bay beneath pale gray skies. Claire stood inside a small neighborhood cafe near Pioneer Square waiting for black coffee, and reviewing sketches for the city restoration proposal balanced carefully inside a leather folder. Around her, people moved with the quiet urgency of weekday mornings. Architects, students, software engineers. Nobody recognized her name here. Nobody studied her face searching for traces of the Whitmore marriage. That anonymity had become its own kind of freedom. She rented a modest apartment overlooking an alley lined with brick buildings and hanging ivy. No marble staircases. No gala invitations. No political fundraisers. Just clean mornings, rain against windows, and evenings spent rebuilding neglected public parks, alongside the nonprofit foundation that had hired her 6 months earlier. The work exhausted her physically in ways luxury never had. But for the first time in years, exhaustion helped her sleep. By afternoon, heavy clouds settled lower across Seattle, as Claire entered the city redevelopment boardroom carrying her presentation materials. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor while rain streaked softly down the glass behind rows of polished conference tables. Wealthy developers filled the room in tailored coats and expensive watches, discussing downtown revitalization projects worth millions. Claire remained near the far end of the table arranging scale models and proposal maps for the nonprofit initiative she had spent months preparing. Her project focused on restoring abandoned public spaces in lower-income neighborhoods instead of replacing them with luxury high-rises. Most investors considered it financially impractical. Claire already knew that before the meeting began. She also knew she was the only person in the room arguing for families who would never attend galas like the one she used to survive beside Daniel. The presentation started smoothly until one of the senior developers interrupted halfway through with a dismissive smile. "Idealistic projects are admirable," he said, leaning back in his chair. "But emotional architecture does not generate revenue." Quiet laughter moved around the table. Claire kept her posture composed even while heat climbed slowly into her chest. Years ago, moments like this would have made her apologize for existing in the room. Instead, she calmly adjusted the architectural plans beneath her fingertips and continued speaking. "Communities survive longer when people feel protected inside them," she answered softly. Another investor exchanged skeptical looks with the board chairman. Then a low male voice interrupted from the opposite end of the room. "She is right." The entire room fell silent. Claire looked up for the first time toward the man seated near the windows. Nathaniel Hale. Even before Seattle, she had heard his name attached to billion-dollar redevelopment projects across the country. Newspapers called him emotionally impossible to read. Investors called him dangerous because he rarely lost negotiations. He sat perfectly still beneath the gray harbor light, one hand resting against a closed portfolio while rain blurred the skyline behind him. Tailored charcoal suit, silver watch, calm eyes that missed nothing. Nathaniel studied Claire for another quiet second before speaking again. "Cities fail when leaders stop caring who gets erased during expansion." Nobody challenged him after that. The meeting shifted immediately. Developers who dismissed Claire minutes earlier suddenly reviewed her proposal with renewed interest, while board members scrambled to reconsider funding percentages. Claire noticed the change with distant disbelief. Not because Nathaniel defended her publicly, because he listened carefully enough to understand what she meant in the first place. After the meeting ended, people filtered slowly into the hallway discussing revised budget numbers and investor opportunities. Claire remained behind gathering scattered presentation materials, while maintenance crews dimmed the conference lights overhead. One of the interns approached awkwardly carrying her damaged scale model. A corner had cracked earlier when another developer brushed carelessly against the display table during the meeting. Someone already fixed it, the intern explained before leaving. Claire frowned slightly and examined the model closer beneath the soft evening light. The damaged edge had been repaired almost invisibly with careful precision. No signature. No note. Just quiet effort. Claire lifted her eyes slowly across the nearly empty boardroom. Near the windows overlooking the rain-dark harbor, Nathaniel Hale adjusted the cuffs of his coat while speaking briefly with an assistant before heading toward the elevators. Right before the doors closed, his gaze met hers for half a second across the silent room. Not flirtation. Not curiosity alone. Recognition. Then the elevator door slid shut between them while Claire remained standing beside the repaired model with something unfamiliar stirring quietly beneath her ribs for the first time in years. Seattle turned silver after dark whenever winter rain rolled in from the sound. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement like blurred gold ribbons, while ferries moved slowly through the harbor beneath low clouds. Claire stood near the edge of a partially restored public square in Pioneer Square with architectural plans tucked beneath one arm, while construction crews packed equipment into trucks nearby. The nonprofit project had finally secured preliminary approval after months of resistance, though every victory still felt fragile inside rooms controlled by wealthy investors. Cold wind moved through the narrow streets between brick buildings, lifting loose strands of hair against her cheek, while she reviewed revised lighting proposals beneath a portable work lamp. "You keep pretending you are not cold." Claire looked up immediately. Nathaniel Hale stood beside her holding a dark wool overcoat over one arm, rain glistening faintly across the shoulders of his charcoal suit. He must have arrived minutes earlier without her noticing. That alone unsettled her slightly. Men like Daniel always entered spaces expecting attention. Nathaniel moved through rooms quietly enough to observe everything first. Claire attempted a polite smile. "I am fine." Nathaniel studied her for a second too long, calm eyes moving briefly toward her hands wrapped tightly around the rolled blueprints. Without another word, he stepped closer and placed the coat carefully across her shoulders. Warmth settled around her instantly, carrying the faint scent of cedar and expensive cologne. The gesture itself remained simple, controlled. Yet Claire felt strangely unprepared for the quiet intimacy of being noticed without needing to ask. Around them, construction crews continued dismantling scaffolding, while rain tapped softly against temporary fencing. Nathaniel glanced toward the unfinished plaza fountain before speaking again. "You have been here since 6 this morning." Claire blinked once. "How do you know that?" "Your assistant mentioned it during the board call." He said it casually, but Claire recognized something unfamiliar beneath the restraint. Attention. Not political calculation. Not obligation. Attention. For several moments neither of them spoke. Cars hissed through rain-slick intersections nearby while the harbor fog rolled lower between the city buildings. Claire looked away first, focusing on the restoration plan spread across the portable table beside them. Nathaniel remained standing beside her in silence that somehow felt easier than silence ever had with Daniel. Weeks passed after that evening with strange subtlety. Nathaniel never overwhelmed her with attention. He simply appeared. At redevelopment meetings, site inspections, quiet strategy dinners with city officials. Always composed. Always listening more carefully than everyone else in the room. Claire slowly realized he remembered details other people ignored completely. Which neighborhoods needed safer lighting. Which elderly residents refused relocation assistance. Which cafe owner cried during zoning hearings because her family had owned the building for 40 years. Nathaniel remembered all of it. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Claire arrived at the nonprofit office expecting another funding rejection. Instead, the executive director hurried toward her holding revised financial reports with visible disbelief. "Do you know what this means?" Claire scanned the numbers quickly. Her breath caught. Millions of dollars had suddenly been redirected toward the restoration initiative through Hale Urban Development. Enough funding to protect the project for years instead of months. "Nathaniel approved this personally," the director whispered. "Half the investors tried killing the proposal last week, and somehow he reversed the entire board." Claire stared down at the paperwork in silence while rain rolled against the office windows behind her. Nathaniel had never mentioned any of it. No dramatic announcement. No expectation of gratitude. He simply protected the project quietly while she continued working, unaware how many battles he had already fought behind closed doors. That realization followed her into the following weekend during a luxury fundraising gala, hosted downtown near the waterfront. Claire attended reluctantly beside nonprofit donors and city officials wearing a black silk gown she had almost convinced herself not to buy. Crystal chandeliers reflected against towering glass walls, while jazz music drifted through the crowded ballroom overlooking Elliott Bay. Claire moved carefully through clusters of investors who still occasionally recognized her as Daniel Whitmore's ex-wife before quickly pretending otherwise. She had nearly reached the exit when camera flashes exploded suddenly near the entrance. Reporters recognized her immediately. "Claire, is it true the Whitmore divorce settlement impacted the Seattle project? Did Daniel Whitmore contact you after the funding announcement?" Questions collided around her while cameras pushed closer through the crowd. Claire instinctively stepped backward beneath the harsh flashes. Then suddenly someone moved between her and the cameras. Nathaniel. He said nothing to the reporters. Did not acknowledge the chaos at all. One steady hand settled lightly at the center of Claire's back, while the other guided her calmly through the crowded ballroom toward the private elevator corridor. The photographers continued shouting behind them, but Nathaniel never released her hand once during the entire walk through the marble hallway. Inside the quieter corridor, the ballroom noise faded into distant music and muffled voices. Claire finally looked down at their joined hands beneath the gold elevator light. Nathaniel followed her gaze almost immediately and loosened his grip slowly, though not before Claire noticed something rare flicker briefly beneath his controlled expression. Concern. The elevator doors opened behind them with a soft chime. Nathaniel held the door without speaking while rain shimmered against the harbor skyline beyond the glass walls. Claire stepped inside first, still wearing his coat across her shoulders. The rain had not stopped in Seattle for 3 straight days by the time Claire realized she had started measuring her weeks by moments with Nathaniel Hale instead of memories of Daniel Whitmore. That realization unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. She stood near the tall windows inside Hale Urban Development headquarters watching ferries disappear into gray harbor fog, while assistants moved quietly through the glass-walled office behind her carrying folders and architectural drafts. The building overlooked Elliott Bay from nearly 40 floors above downtown, all steel, marble and restrained luxury that somehow reflected Nathaniel perfectly. Elegant without performance. Powerful without noise. Claire adjusted the sleeve of her cream cashmere sweater, while reviewing revised funding proposals spread across the conference table. Nathaniel stood across from her near the espresso bar, jacket removed, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms while speaking with one of his legal advisors about zoning approvals. He listened more than he spoke. Everyone in the room adapted themselves around his silence automatically. Once the meeting ended and the advisors disappeared into the hallway, the office grew quieter beneath the muted sound of rain against the windows. Claire closed the final project folder carefully before finally asking the question she had been carrying for weeks. "Why are you helping me?" Nathaniel looked up slowly, not surprised by the question, almost as though he had been waiting for it. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then his eyes shifted briefly toward the harbor lights beyond the glass before returning to her. "Because nobody helped you when they should have." The words settled into the silence between them with dangerous softness. Claire felt her breath catch unexpectedly. Nathaniel did not say it with pity. That was what made it unbearable. He said it like someone who had been paying attention for a long time. Claire looked down immediately, fingertips tightening lightly around the edge of the conference table, while emotion moved quietly beneath her composure. Nobody had ever described her marriage so simply before. Not broken. Not dramatic. Just unsupported. Nathaniel stepped closer only enough to place the finalized proposal folder beside her hand. Nothing more. Yet Claire felt the shift anyway. Something emotional and irreversible beginning to unfold beneath all the restraint. 2 days later, Seattle hosted an international redevelopment summit at the Four Seasons downtown. Investors, politicians, and corporate executives crowded the ballroom beneath gold lighting and towering floral arrangements while rain shimmered against the harbor outside. Claire attended beside her non-profit board members wearing a black velvet gown simple enough to avoid attention. She had learned long ago that elegance became more dangerous when understated. Nathaniel arrived nearly an hour later surrounded by city officials and investment groups, his calm presence quietly dominating the ballroom without effort. Claire noticed women watching him throughout the evening. Men too. Power attracted attention naturally. But Nathaniel barely acknowledged any of it. Halfway through dinner service, Claire excused herself toward the quieter terrace corridor overlooking the waterfront. She had just stepped beneath the covered balcony when she heard a familiar voice behind her. Daniel. Her body reacted before her mind did, shoulders tightening instantly beneath the cold evening air. Daniel Whitmore stood near the entrance beside two New York investors, dressed in a dark navy coat dampened slightly by the rain outside. For one suspended second, neither of them moved. Daniel stared at her with visible disbelief. Not because she looked beautiful. Claire understood that immediately. It was because she no longer looked emotionally broken. The old version of her would have looked nervous, hopeful, fragile around him. This Claire stood calmly beneath the harbor lights with quiet confidence settling naturally into her posture. Then Nathaniel appeared beside her carrying two untouched champagne glasses. Daniel's eyes shifted toward him instantly. The realization hit slowly across his expression. Nathaniel Hale. Standing beside Claire. Close enough to matter. Claire accepted the glass from Nathaniel without speaking while the cold Seattle wind moved through the terrace behind them. For the first time since their divorce, Daniel looked genuinely uncertain. Not angry. Not possessive. Unsteady. Claire, he said carefully, as though testing whether he still had the right to say her name that way. She offered a small polite nod. Daniel. The investors beside him exchanged awkward glances before quietly retreating back inside the ballroom, sensing tension too expensive to interrupt. Nathaniel remained calm beside her, one hand resting loosely inside his coat pocket. He did not try to dominate the moment. Somehow that restraint made his presence even more powerful. Later that night after the summit ended, Claire attended a private strategy dinner with city officials and investors inside a luxury waterfront restaurant. Daniel remained there too, seated across the room beneath dim amber lighting while rain rolled down the tall windows overlooking Elliott Bay. Claire ignored him successfully for most of the evening until one careless comment from another executive shifted the atmosphere entirely. You handled the divorce remarkably well, the man remarked lightly over dessert wine. Most women disappear socially after something like that. The room grew quieter immediately. Claire smiled politely, but the old humiliation hit her chest faster than expected. Her breathing turned shallow beneath the crowded room and glittering lights. Suddenly she could not hear the conversation clearly anymore. She excused herself quietly and stepped into the empty hotel corridor outside, gripping the marble windowsill while panic climbed violently through her chest without warning. Years of emotional survival crashing into one unbearable moment. She slid slowly down against the wall, breathing unevenly beneath the soft hallway lights. Minutes later, footsteps approached carefully across the carpet. Nathaniel. He said nothing when he saw her sitting there. Did not ask questions. Did not force comfort. He simply lowered himself beside her onto the hotel floor in complete silence while rain tapped softly against the windows overlooking the harbor below. His shoulder rested near hers without touching. Calm. Steady. Safe. Claire closed her eyes briefly, focusing on the rhythm of his breathing beside her until her own finally slowed to match it. Manhattan glittered differently than Seattle. Sharper. Colder. The city looked like polished steel beneath the December rain while black cars lined the entrance of the Astoria Grand Hotel, one after another beneath flashing cameras and gold canopy lights. Claire stepped out of Nathaniel Hale's car slowly, one gloved hand resting lightly against his offered arm while reporters immediately surged forward behind velvet barricades. The gala had become one of the largest charity events on the East Coast, drawing politicians, developers, old money families, and media executives into the same chandelier-filled ballroom every winter. Once upon a time, Claire attended events like this as Daniel Whitmore's wife. Tonight, she arrived beside Nathaniel Hale. The difference changed everything. Her dark emerald gown moved softly against the marble staircase, as camera flashes reflected across rainwater near the entrance. Nathaniel remained beside her with effortless calm, one hand steady at the small of her back while security guided them inside the crowded hotel lobby. Claire felt hundreds of eyes follow them instantly. Recognition spread quietly through the ballroom before anyone spoke her name aloud. Former donors from Boston, political consultants, wealthy socialites who once watched her smile politely beside Daniel, while slowly disappearing emotionally in plain sight. Now those same people stared differently. Curious, uncertain, almost cautious. Gold chandelier light spilled across the ballroom ceiling while an orchestra played softly near the stage. Nathaniel greeted investors with restrained professionalism, but Claire noticed something immediately. He never allowed distance to grow between them for long. Every time another conversation pulled him away, his eyes found her again across the room within seconds. Quietly, instinctively, Daniel arrived nearly 20 minutes later. Claire saw him before he saw her. Dark tuxedo, controlled posture, Boston political royalty wrapped inside perfect composure. But when his gaze finally landed across the ballroom toward Nathaniel standing beside her near the champagne tower, something shifted visibly inside him. Shock first, then disbelief. Daniel crossed the ballroom slowly through clusters of guests, while conversations softened around them instinctively. Claire remained perfectly calm beneath the chandelier light even as old memories threatened briefly beneath her ribs. Nathaniel noticed Daniel approaching before she said a word. He did not tense, did not step forward possessively. He simply stayed beside her. Daniel stopped only a few feet away, eyes moving carefully between them. "Are you with him now?" The question came out quieter than Claire expected. Not angry, not mocking, wounded in a way she had never heard from him before. Claire held his gaze steadily while the orchestra music drifted softly around them. Then she answered with calm honesty that surprised even herself. "I am finally with someone who sees me." Silence followed immediately. Daniel's expression barely changed outwardly, but Claire watched the words land inside him anyway. Nathaniel said nothing beside her. Somehow his silence made the moment feel even more devastating. Before Daniel could respond, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the charity auction began near the central stage. Wealthy guests moved toward their assigned tables while servers carried champagne through the crowd beneath gold lighting and mirrored walls. Claire expected Nathaniel to join the executive donors near the front platform. Instead, he guided her toward a quieter table closer to the center of the ballroom where she could still see the harbor lights beyond the towering windows. The auction moved quickly. Multi-million-dollar bids for museums, redevelopment projects, and political foundations echoed across the ballroom while applause rose and fell in waves beneath the chandeliers. Nathaniel remained composed throughout most of it, speaking only when necessary. Then the auction host announced the final development initiative of the evening. A one-time naming dedication attached to the new East Harbor Restoration Project. Investors immediately raised paddles across the ballroom. Numbers climbed rapidly. 3 million. 4 million. 5. Claire watched quietly, assuming another corporate group would eventually claim the dedication rights for publicity. Then Nathaniel lifted his paddle once. The ballroom fell silent almost instantly. $7 million. The auctioneer announced with visible surprise. No one countered him. The room erupted into applause moments later, while cameras turned toward Nathaniel beneath the chandelier light. The auctioneer smiled broadly toward the stage. "Mr. Hale, what name would you like attached to the project dedication?" Nathaniel stood slowly from his chair. Claire looked up at him confused. He adjusted the cuff of his jacket calmly before answering into the microphone. "The Claire Whitmore Community Restoration Initiative." For one suspended second, the entire ballroom went completely still. Claire felt the sound leave her body. Around them, applause exploded louder than before while cameras flashed endlessly across the room. Nathaniel returned to his seat beside her as though he had not just changed the entire atmosphere of the evening. Claire stared at him speechless beneath the overwhelming gold light and applause. "Nathaniel!" Her voice nearly disappeared. He only looked at her quietly. People should know who rebuilt the city. Across the ballroom, Daniel remained motionless beside the donor tables, watching everything unfold with an expression Claire could no longer fully read. Later that evening, investors crowded around Nathaniel near the dance floor requesting meetings, interviews, and negotiations connected to the announcement. Powerful men waited for his attention beneath crystal light and flashing cameras. Yet the moment Nathaniel noticed Claire growing overwhelmed by the crowd pressing around them, he excused himself from every conversation without hesitation and crossed the ballroom directly toward her instead. The investors stopped speaking immediately as he reached her side. "You should breathe for a minute," he said softly. His attention never returned to the room behind him, not even once. Claire looked up at him beneath the chandelier glow while applause still echoed faintly through the ballroom. For the first time in years, someone with power had chosen her publicly instead of asking her to become smaller beside it. The gala ended after midnight, but Manhattan still glowed awake beneath the rain. Black cars slid through wet streets below the Astoria Grand, while flashes from lingering photographers reflected against puddles outside the hotel entrance. Inside the upper levels of the building, the noise of the ballroom faded into distant music and muffled laughter. Claire stood alone for a moment near the rooftop terrace overlooking the city skyline, one hand resting lightly against the cold stone railing while December wind moved softly through the loose curls at her shoulders. The harbor lights shimmered far below like scattered gold across dark water. Behind her, the rooftop doors opened quietly. Nathaniel stepped outside carrying 2 untouched glasses of champagne neither of them really wanted anymore. He handed one to her anyway before moving beside the railing. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them had changed over the past months. It no longer felt uncertain. It felt inhabited, comfortable in a way Claire had forgotten silence could become. Rain tapped softly against the glass structures surrounding the rooftop while helicopters moved distantly above the skyline. Nathaniel looked toward the city lights instead of directly at her when he finally spoke. "You make every room feel less empty." The words landed so gently Claire almost missed them at first. Her fingers tightened slightly around the stem of the champagne glass. Nathaniel still did not look at her fully. That restraint somehow made the confession feel more intimate, more dangerous. Claire turned toward him slowly beneath the soft rooftop lighting. She could feel the answer rising inside her before she even understood it herself. Something honest. Something she had spent years emotionally starving for without realizing it. "Nathaniel, Footsteps interrupted them suddenly behind the terrace doors. 2 board members emerged onto the rooftop discussing investment schedules loudly enough to fracture the moment instantly. Nathaniel stepped back almost automatically, expression smoothing into composure again, while Claire lowered her gaze toward the city below. The unfinished sentence remained suspended invisibly between them, untouched. Later that evening, Claire left the rooftop briefly to retrieve her coat from a private lounge corridor lined with antique mirrors and velvet seating. The hotel had quieted considerably after most guests departed, leaving only distant piano music drifting through the hallways. She reached for her coat when another familiar voice stopped her softly from behind. "Claire." Daniel stood near the entrance of the corridor holding a whiskey glass loosely in one hand, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned for the first time all evening. Without the ballroom lights and political crowds surrounding him, he suddenly looked older somehow. Not physically, emotionally exhausted. Claire remained still but did not retreat. Rain traced slowly across the tall windows behind him while muted city lights blurred through the glass. Daniel exhaled carefully before speaking again. "I reread every letter you ever wrote me after the divorce." Claire blinked once, caught off guard despite herself. Daniel gave a quiet, humorless smile while staring down at the amber whiskey in his glass. "Birthday letters. Anniversary cards. Notes you left on flights before my meetings." His voice lowered further. "I kept all of them." The confession carried none of his old arrogance now, only regret arriving years too late. Claire watched him silently while the soft piano music echoed faintly through the corridor. Daniel lifted his eyes toward her again. "I still cannot understand why I failed you when you stayed." The question broke something quietly inside the space between them. Not because Claire still needed his apology, but because she realized he genuinely did not know the answer. Men like Daniel were raised to believe loyalty would survive emotional neglect forever. That realization carried its own tragedy. Claire stepped closer only enough to speak gently without cruelty. "You stopped seeing me long before I left." Daniel looked down immediately, jaw tightening slightly as the truth settled into him with unbearable clarity. Before either of them could continue, voices approached from the hallway beyond the lounge. political donors, security staff. Another interruption. Daniel stepped back first this time, masking his expression carefully before anyone entered the corridor. Claire collected her coat silently and walked away without looking behind her again. Near 2 o'clock in the morning, she finally returned to the private penthouse suite the hotel reserved for Nathaniel during Manhattan negotiations. The space overlooked Central Park through towering windows blurred with rain while low jazz music played softly from hidden speakers. Claire removed her earrings slowly beside the fireplace, exhaustion settling into her shoulders after the emotionally impossible evening. Nathaniel had not returned yet from his final investor meetings downstairs. She moved quietly through the suite searching for a glass of water, when she noticed a leather journal resting partially open on the study table near the windows. Her old journal. Claire froze instantly. She must have packed it accidentally during the Seattle trip weeks earlier. The pages contained fragments of her marriage she never intended anyone else to see. Wedding vows. Private thoughts. Grief written in sleepless handwriting. Before she could reach it, the suite door opened behind her. Nathaniel stepped inside, rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. His eyes moved immediately toward the journal already open on the table between them. Claire felt panic rise briefly inside her chest. But Nathaniel only crossed the room calmly, placed his keys beside the fireplace, and gently closed the journal without reading another word. His hand rested against the cover for half a second before he looked at her quietly. No judgment. No curiosity. Only understanding. Claire swallowed carefully while emotion tightened unexpectedly in her throat. Nathaniel loosened his tie slowly beneath the soft gold lighting and spoke almost gently. You do not have to explain who you were before. Outside the windows, rain continued falling over Manhattan, while Claire stood motionless beside the closed journal, realizing with sudden terrifying clarity that Nathaniel Hale was becoming the safest place her heart had ever known. Snow began falling over Manhattan just before the final ceremony of the weekend. Soft white flakes drifted past the towering windows of the Astoria Grand Ballroom, while hundreds of guests gathered beneath crystal chandeliers and gold candlelight for the closing philanthropic announcement tied to the East Harbor Restoration Initiative. The ballroom looked almost unreal beneath the winter glow. Black tuxedos, silk gowns, champagne reflecting across polished marble floors. Wealthy conversations floating softly through the orchestra music. Claire stood near the center balcony overlooking the ballroom in a silver evening gown Nathaniel had quietly arranged to be delivered to her suite that morning without explanation or expectation. The fabric shimmered faintly beneath the chandelier light, while snow gathered against the city skyline beyond the windows. She no longer looked like a woman recovering from heartbreak. She looked like someone who had survived it completely. Nathaniel remained downstairs speaking with political donors and development executives, while cameras followed his every movement across the ballroom. Yet even across the crowded room, Claire could still feel when his attention returned to her. It always did. Daniel found her alone near the balcony just before the final presentation began. He approached slowly this time, as though understanding too much force might make her disappear entirely. The orchestra softened in the background while guests drifted toward the stage below them. Daniel stopped beside her beneath the gold lighting, his expression carrying the exhaustion of a man finally confronting the full weight of his own mistakes. If I asked you to come back, he said quietly, would you? Claire looked out across Manhattan first instead of answering immediately. Snow moved gently beyond the glass while black cars glided through the streets below like shadows beneath white light. For years, she had imagined hearing those words from him. Once they would have healed her instantly. Now they only made her sad for the woman who used to wait for them. Claire turned toward Daniel slowly. Her eyes remained calm, gentle even. You are asking the wrong version of me. The truth settled between them with quiet finality. Daniel lowered his gaze immediately, emotion tightening visibly across his face before he looked away toward the ballroom below. For the first time since Claire met him, he appeared truly powerless. Not financially, emotionally. A wave of applause suddenly erupted beneath them as the master of ceremonies announced Nathaniel's appearance on stage for the final development contract signing tied to the Restoration Initiative. Daniel glanced toward the stage while Claire stepped away from the balcony railing. Claire, he said one last time, softer now. She paused briefly. Daniel swallowed carefully before speaking again. I did love you. I just realized it too late. Claire studied him quietly for a moment beneath the falling snow outside the windows. Then she answered with heartbreaking honesty instead of cruelty. I know. She left him standing alone at the balcony while she descended the grand staircase toward the ballroom floor below. Hundreds of guests turned instinctively as Claire crossed the marble beneath the chandeliers. Not because she demanded attention. Because confidence had finally replaced the ache she used to carry into every room. Nathaniel stood near the stage surrounded by executives, political figures, and investors waiting for him to finalize the largest redevelopment agreement of the year. Reporters crowded near the front platform while cameras flashed endlessly across the ballroom. Then Nathaniel saw Claire moving through the crowd. Everything else disappeared from his focus immediately. One of the investors continued discussing negotiation terms beside him, but Nathaniel interrupted the conversation mid-sentence without apology and stepped away from the contract table entirely. The ballroom quieted almost instantly in confusion while cameras followed him crossing directly toward Claire instead of the stage. The symbolic weight of the moment spread through the room immediately. Nathaniel stopped in front of her beneath the chandelier light while snow drifted softly beyond the towering windows behind them. He reached for her hand carefully, as though it was still something precious enough to handle gently. You do not have to stand alone anymore, he said softly. Claire felt emotion rise unexpectedly into her chest. Not because he rescued her. Because he never once asked her to become smaller beside him. Around them, wealthy guests watched in complete silence while cameras flashed endlessly across the ballroom. Nathaniel lifted her hand slowly and pressed it against his chest over his heart for one suspended second before guiding her beside him toward the stage instead of ahead of him or behind him. Beside him. Equal. Chosen. The ballroom erupted into applause as they reached the platform together. Claire glanced once toward the upper balcony where Daniel still stood watching beneath the gold light and falling snow outside the windows. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room. Claire no longer looked wounded. Daniel no longer looked untouchable. The reversal felt complete without either of them saying another word. Nathaniel signed the final restoration contract calmly before stepping aside and offering the ceremonial pen to Claire instead. Another wave of applause thundered through the ballroom as she accepted it with trembling fingers. The cameras captured everything. The woman once mistaken for invisible now standing at the center of the room with the most powerful man in the city choosing her publicly without hesitation. Later that night, the snow covered Manhattan in soft white silence while Nathaniel and Claire stepped into the waiting black car outside the hotel entrance. Reporters shouted questions behind them. Flashbulbs reflected across the falling snow. Nathaniel opened the car door for her first before sliding in beside her. Warm light filled the quiet interior while the city blurred softly beyond the rain-speckled windows. Claire leaned back against the leather seat and exhaled slowly, almost as though releasing years of grief all at once. Nathaniel reached for her hand carefully in the dim light between them. This time Claire held his hand first. Outside, the Astoria Grand faded behind them beneath the falling snow while Manhattan glowed silver and gold against the winter night. And for the first time in her life, Claire no longer felt like someone begging to be loved. She felt chosen.